So I'm here with Sarah Curro, hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, who is the first violin with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And Sarah has generously given me some of her time to talk about her work with the MSO and perhaps share some of her experiences, especially in relation to film scores and film score recording. So thank you, Sarah. Welcome.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. So can we start with a bit of background in terms of your performing career? What were some of the key milestones on your way to your current position with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra that actually got you there?
Well, my trajectory was pretty set from when I was about 8 years old because by the time I was eight, I'd gone to see a lot of my father's youth orchestra concerts because my father started the Queensland Youth Orchestra, John Curro, and that orchestra's been going for 53 years. So I joined in the junior strings group at eight, and I went all the way up to the end of my university years in 1994, because you can go up the ranks through the orchestras and then you get to the top youth orchestra. And so I already knew I was going to play in orchestras. There wasn't any light bulb moment. It was just always, and it's not because my parents forced me, it's just because that's the way it was. And I had an older sister whose trajectory I could see, and it looked great to me, and she's 7 years older. So I had this really clear path. And because of the youth orchestra, I learned really young to appreciate modern music because Dad would always commission a local composer once or twice a year to write a piece for full symphony orchestra, and his orchestra would play it. So when I was 14, I played this crazy piece called Symphony Diabolica or Dialectica or something by Peter Rankin. And it was crazy. This piece was insane, but we got to know it so well that it became a part of our bodies and minds. So it, ever since I was 14, I'm not afraid of new music or strange music or music that's not just your Brahms and your Beethoven. So then I went to study in Tasmania with my godfather, who was a violin teacher, and I worked with Tassie Symphony Orchestra, ACO, QSO, QPO, most of them really. And then I got a job in Hong Kong Philharmonic. And when I was there, I got really sick of classical music and I bought an electric violin.
Beautiful.
Playing in nightclubs with DJs. That was really fun. And then I started commissioning composers myself for my husband's instruments, which are semi-acoustic instruments. They're like this groundbreaking thing. And I just say to the composers, here's the choice of instruments. Pick one and write a piece, 4 to 7 minutes long. I'll pay you and I'll put it on in a concert.
It's just fascinating to see how the history of art music, so to speak, orchestral music, is reflected in scores, even through last century, and how modernism came into pictures. And in some cases, as I'm sure you'll agree, certain styles, especially modernist styles, found more audience and more success in their use in film scores than they probably ever did in the concert hall.
I'm absolutely obsessed with film music because if it wasn't for John Williams in the 70s, the symphony orchestra would have zero current relevance to society. So I just love that man because now all these orchestras are making a lot of money selling high-priced tickets to people who want to come and see a film with a big symphony orchestra on the stage. So it's really, really remarkable.
I would think as an orchestral performer, I mean, you mentioned the sort of masters such as Brahms and Beethoven and so forth, and I can imagine in performing those pieces in a standard concert situation, you would have just a lifelong familiarity with those masterworks, and you could bring that to the stage when you perform. But in film music recording, I'm guessing you'd be in a session and you'd have music put in front of you that you've never seen before. And I'm just wondering, how does that experience differ for you, and what do you have to bring to those sessions that will enable that music to be expressed at the level that it needs to be for a successful recording?
Yeah, well, there's not many people who I've worked with that actually have the screen up there and tell you what the particular part of the story is that you're playing to, because the cues are quite short. So you just get M1701 or something. You just get that sort of title, and there's not many of the composers or the producers who put music in front of you that gives you any idea what you're playing for. So you just have to trust what's on the page and trust the direction of the conductor. Um, or whoever's in the booth. So it's actually quite a fragmented experience most of the time.
Yeah. Well, that was
There's
actually one of my questions also. Well, two things you mentioned. One is do you ever get that opportunity to know something about what that music is representing and therefore at some level be able to put more into it? And if not, what does the conductor do in terms of preparing you as the orchestra for the recording that maybe makes up for that in a way that perhaps wouldn't need to happen in one of the more familiar masterwork performances?
Yeah, oh, there's a lot to talk about with this issue. Because we're not the LSO going in to record Star Wars with John Williams, which is like playing Wagner. There's Luke's theme, there's Leia's theme, so that's like playing a tone poem or a big Wagner opera, okay? And they've got the screen up there, and he conducts it with the film with no click track. Apparently, this is what I've heard. I have friends who know him and have been in that situation with him, and that's what they say about John Williams. That is the most luxurious situation, and that's not going to happen unless you've got like so much money. So the rest of us, for the rest of the time in this activity, it's usually spent trying to get these little snippets down as fast as possible, as efficiently as possible, which means talking less. So we don't really need someone to come in and explain to us what part of the movie it is and so on, if it's quite clearly written on the page. So if it's written on the page, one word, espressivo, or sadly, or anything, just one word will kind of let you know how to play it. And then there's the conductor, who hopefully has had a few meetings with the guys who are making the film. And then that conductor will be able to just quickly and efficiently say, this needs to be more shimmering, or this is the part of the film where this person's dying. Okay, so it's not really up to us to bring anything to it. We just have to be faithful disciples, just follow what we're told to do. I find that in TV, it's much more close. The director will come in, the composer will come in, they're really excited about their project. It's usually a low budget thing. And they get really, really excited about this special project that they're making. And then they talk about the story, and this is this character and that character. But most of the time, musicians, they're sort of on the clock. They're like, we've got this music to get through. Let's get through it, because it's only one call and one fee, and But I don't know, when you've got these people who have tried really hard to get funding, it's a really special thing for them. I find that as well in recording for bands. The big bands that are already backed by Sony, it's more of a cynical exercise for them because, this is their sixth album or whatever. But with these up-and-coming bands, it's so special to them. They want you to be a part of their amazing emotional journey. But I'm afraid that a lot of the time, most of the musicians don't care what it's about. It's just a gig. I'm not like that. I find it really exciting when people are making their project come to life. Those experiences are beautiful. Then you really feel, oh, gosh, we're doing this great thing. We're collaborating with these people. Yeah, it's not a cynical exercise. Yeah.
Well, that was actually, again, one of my questions. The quality of the writing or the quality of the orchestrating, as a professional, you're obviously there doing a very professional job no matter what's in front of you. But as a musician and as an artist, I was hoping you could speak a bit to that, how what you find on the page in front of you affects your experience for the session and then ultimately the final result.
Yeah, there's a lot of times where the composers, especially if the composers, it's their first time writing for screen, or maybe they're just being given a chance but they're not established composers yet, or I know this doesn't directly go with what you're asking, but sometimes the band members write their own charts for the strings. So in all of those examples, the TV ones, when it's just say a string quartet, I know maybe you're asking only about symphony orchestras, but this does happen in the
Oh,
symphony.
really?
So when we're in the symphony and it's a film score or video game score, something like that, and there's a note that's obviously not fitting, or there's a note that is sticking out because the voicing isn't great, because the composers aren't, let's say they're not at the top of their game in terms of orchestration, then we'll all get really cross, actually. We'll be like, hey, that note should be this note, and we'll pass it up to the concertmaster, and the concertmaster will be like, yeah, and the concertmaster will talk to the conductor, and then the conductor will ring into the booth and go, maybe that note could be given to the flute instead of the, so we
Brilliant.
do get a bit annoyed when it's tonal music, but if it's not, see, the problem with tonal music or Western European art music, as we call it now, the problem with writing in that style is that if you don't have your voice leading and your chord progressions totally down in a technical sense, it's just going to sound like bad music. Because the problem is we've had 200, 300, 400 years to get used to, go back to Bach, say. These are standard chord progressions for us now. We're so used to them being written really well by the masters who have survived. We're so used to hearing it. But if some young composer comes in and writes a standard chord progression but doesn't voice it properly, like mixes up who should go
third
where,
and stuff. Or whatever. Yeah.
and because they don't have 100% handle on the formal structure of writing in that style, because they don't have a handle on it, they can't push its limits outwards and make a new sound for themselves. So that's where I get really sad that the education system doesn't include music from a really early age. Just standard music, chord progressions, like the AMEB. Everyone should be doing that. Just basic chord progressions, musicianship. It's part of our culture. So that's what often happens in recording sessions. If they're the low budget ones without a conductor, say, like if there's just 4 of us, we will start revoicing chords and telling the booth the chord would sound better this way. So sometimes we can take over, and they really appreciate that because we know what they're trying to do and we just know how it would. We're not composers, but we know when something sounds wrong and why. So we can sort of be in damage control. And if there's too many Fs in a chord, it's going to overbalance it and not sound great. So
Exactly.
just little technical issues like that.
On a similar level, what about the planning for a session where you might have, the order in which you record cues, or when and where and if you do overdubs and multi-tracking, or break down into sections for different recordings? That can obviously change everything about the flow and how the music is coming out. And do you find that there's a range of experiences at that level as well?
We never take responsibility for that, the musicians, ever. Because we know so little about it before we get there, we'd never take responsibility for that. I've never been in a situation where any musician takes responsibility. It's always the composer with the engineers.
Yes, but you would notice when it hasn't been done very well. Yeah, is it clear and obvious when someone could have done that job better, and you're just thinking Jesus and rolling your eyes, and would you be able to give feedback? Are there good channels of communication to give feedback back up the line that's eventually going to get back to the composer, you think, or the producer even?
Okay, so the guy who is my favorite to work with, I don't know how confidential this situation is, but I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about him, but what he usually does is he books us for more time than he needs, and then we get all of his stuff done, and then he uses the rest of the time to just sort of experiment and like try a whole bunch of different stuff. And that tends to really annoy people who don't know him, because what usually happens with musicians is if there's a pile of music that you've got to get through and you finish it before the end of the call, you want to go. You don't want to sit there working right up until the last minute. And that's very kind of cynical. Again, a lot of musicians are like, yeah, early minute, yeah, let's go. But what he does is he always just tries to sneak in a few little extra things. But because I've worked with him for so long and I love what he does, he's so great and he's so eccentric that I'll just do anything for him. It's fine, and he pays really well. So, and in my opinion, you are paid for your time. If they are too disorganized and do not get what they need done in that time, that's completely their fault and their inefficiency. And then they have an option to pay for overtime. So for us, it's just a cynical exercise of this is the time we're paid for, and if you go over, you have to pay us extra. And that all came about in the 80s because, oh, you mentioned overdubs before. So what was happening in the 80s in this country was that people were hiring, say, a string quartet, but they were making them do overdubs to make it sound like they were having a big string orchestra. So that irritated the musicians union, the musicians and the union as it grew. And they decided that if you were going to do any overdubs, you'd have to pay extra. So if you were going to give the impression that you had more musicians than you did, you would have to pay a percentage fee of each overdub line. Now, I'm in the generation of people who were not, I wasn't exploited, so I don't have that attitude towards overdubbing. And so now, if I'm paid for 3 hours and I have to overdub one line 16 times, I don't care. But that hardly ever happens anyway, because music now that's been written, that I've been involved in, it's not symphonic anymore. The fashion is changed. It's going to be more narrowly focused, more sparsely written. Like even Hans Zimmer, who's this epic composer and has a full handle on this language, he writes quite minimalistically. He doesn't have to because he's got the whole. He could write like John Williams if he wanted to, but he's made his own style at being quite simplistic harmonies and a lot of repetition because that's the fashion. So I'm in a generation of musicians now who will go to a session and every chart or every fragment of music will be super easy, but it's just getting that precision rhythm down, which takes the most time.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's not like in the old days where some of my colleagues who've retired, they played the soundtrack of Scent of a Woman and Mad Max and all these big, scores. But it seems like movies, except for the John Williams, the big American movies, it seems like the film scores for the newer movies are more sparse. Yeah.
Yeah, that leads me to another line of questions, which whether you could talk to a bit about when there is other technology involved, for instance, such as electronic elements of the score. Will you generally get fed that as in your headphones, and do you sometimes even have to play along with orchestral mock-ups that have been done on sample-based recordings, and how is that experience compared to just being able to play from scratch?
The common misconception is that we would need all of that information in our earphones to play the best that we possibly can. But if we have a mock-up, like MIDI orchestra or whatever, we can't play properly in tune with each other. So every recording session I've ever been in that offers us something like that in the headphones, me and all of my similarly minded people who I work with quite a lot, they don't want it. They don't want anything in there. They want the click track and maybe a guitar, because if there's some particular mood that we need to understand, but we'll strip that feed bare, because anything that's in there will sort of derail what we're trying to do, which is reflect what's on that page. We're the string component of whatever layering situation is happening. So often the booth will think that we need all this inspiration, but because we're not approaching it as a epic musical story oriented thing, we're just trying to get what's on the paper recorded. So yeah, that's an interesting question. But yeah, most of the time we'll just say, no, get rid of the track because we can't hear properly,
What about smaller sessions or ones where you're working more intimately with a composer, whether in film or even with general commissions? Is that, I'm gathering from what you've already said, that's a working relationship you would hope for. And in that case, what would some of the qualities of that relationship be that would make it both rewarding and successful in terms of what comes out of it?
In my own series, I commission sort of emerging student type composers who haven't quite set their style yet or whatever, and it's just an opportunity for them to have a piece that they write performed in a public setting, because that gives them a bit of self-esteem and makes them feel, oh yeah, I can be a composer. So most of the time when they send the piece that they've written, I'll just go through it, and then if it's um, more than 30% ridiculous, then I'll have a meeting with them and I'll say, hey, this is ridiculous. Is there any different way we can write this? So I basically go through it and just tidy it up in terms of playability. Because one of the reasons composers' works don't get out there is because they're too hard. They're not idiomatic enough. And musicians are the ones who decide whether a premiere will get another airing again. I mean, anyone can get a premiere. All you have to do is pay someone to play your music, right? Anyone can do that. That's not a big deal. But getting a second, third, fourth, fifth performance, you'll only get that if your piece is so playable that not only is it enjoyable to hear, and I don't mean just sounding like Brahms, I mean just cool or, some excellent, interesting element to it, but it also has to be playable. So you want to repeat it again and again and again. And you want other people to go, what was that piece? Can I have the music? So I go through with the composers, the playability of it. And the hardest part is with the more established composers, because I don't think they're used to that mentality. Do you want this piece played again and again and again? Let's clean it up. Let's make it a bit easier so that more than just the top level can play this piece.
A lot of film scores these days are so sparse. There's not a lot of demands technically on the players. If it's too simple, do you find yourself falling asleep at the session and just thinking, I wish there was more to grab hold of,
Yeah, that's a really good concern that maybe composers do have. They want to write something meaningful. They want to write something epic, but at the same time, you have to think in practical terms. If you've got one call of 3 hours and you've got all of these film cues, how can you say what you want to say in the simplest possible way to reflect whatever the movie needs? It doesn't really matter what the musicians think. If it's something really hard, then you have to write something really hard, and we have to try our best to do it in that short space of time. Don't be influenced by like a second guessing attitude towards musicians, because musicians, as I've said, a lot of the time they're so busy, especially the freelance ones, they don't have time to practice your part. Even if you send it to them before that session, the expectation is they're going to be able to do it within that 3-hour period as a group and individually. So you've got to sort of trust that they're professional enough to not look at the music before, or you can just reassess, okay, why does this bit that I'm writing, why does this have to be really hard? Is there a way I can do it to make it sound really, really difficult and keep it simple for the individuals? And that's a real challenge. I tell you who does that really well. Jurassic Park was a really great one. But my point about John Williams and difficulty level is you've got Superman, which is actually the hardest thing I have ever played, all the way up to Harry Potter, which is still difficult, but he's got such better craft by this stage that whatever difficulty you're playing, it's much more idiomatic and it comes to you quicker, whereas Superman's more random and just writing runs for the sake of runs. And so you see this span of 20, 30 years, and he's really refined it down to, okay, I need a really massive run here. How am I going to make it extremely... And so I'm sort of thinking about Hedwig's theme in Harry Potter, the runs at the beginning with the violins. The thing about those runs is that if you ghost them, that's what they're supposed to sound like. They're not supposed to sound like a melody. You're supposed to just ghost through the notes. Whereas with Superman, if you're not getting all of those notes, it sounds out of tune and really bad. And so that's what I mean about idiomatic writing, is that it all fits under the hand beautifully. And John Williams had learned over a span of decades how to get something sounding really hard and really amazing, but writing it a little bit more easily for the instruments.
To finish up then, kind of along the same lines again of what you've been talking about, I was just going to ask for, what would you say if in terms of general advice to composers who are working for film and want to make that experience of playing and successful sessions and having everything come out, what would be your primary kind of points of advice for both young and old composers getting into film music?
Yeah, Yeah, look, I know this sounds really obvious, but I think watching all different types of films with the focus on the music, and if you can get those films that have commentary, like for example, Attack of the Clones, that second new mid-period Star Wars, I mean, those middle ones are kind of bad, but John Williams does some amazing things in Attack of the Clones, and if you put the commentary on, you learn about the score actually, as well as some directorial things that they're talking about. So, if you can find critiques on film scores and then talk about that, and then watch the film in terms of, okay, now I'm just only going to focus on what the music does here. Don't get distracted by the text. Just go to that behind level and hear how the music is supporting the mood, the atmosphere, whatever. So I know, I'll say it again, that sounds really obvious, but really, when you're practicing your craft, you have to copy and copy and copy and copy. This isn't going to come to you in a vacuum. This is the misguided thinking of what creativity is now. Oh, you're just creative. You're this musician. You're creative. No, no, no. Any genius copied. Like early Beethoven sounds like bad Mozart. Okay, so everyone did it. And all of a sudden in the 20th and 21st century, it's bad to copy. You have to be original. This is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. I couldn't have played the violin unless I copied my big sister. There's got to be some element of copying and copying and copying until you're great at it. And then you can start branching out and doing your own thing. But then you've got this beautiful foundation of what's happened before. So if you want to write tonal music, you study Bach and Beethoven and Mozart. And then go and study what the English people did. We totally neglect what English classical music brought. And then go and study the Eastern Europeans. Let's get more than one language happening, because we're all very familiar with the Germanic language. That's it. That's why we think it's the greatest, because we're the most familiar with it. Mm-hmm. It's not the greatest. It's just one of the languages. That's it. So if we get familiar with the English, the Czech, get familiar with all of the languages, then your palette is so colourful, right? So that's my advice. Just copy and listen. That's all.
Beautiful. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. It's been wonderful hearing your thoughts, and it's fantastic input. I've learned loads and really appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks.